The sun hung low over the parched town of Dry Creek, casting long shadows across the dust-choked main street. It was noon, the hour when the town seemed to hold its breath, as if the desert itself paused to watch. Children huddled behind doorways, eyes wide, while the older men leaned against the wooden railings of the saloon, hands hovering near revolvers they rarely drew. The wind scoured the street with grit and cinders, carrying the bitter scent of fear and smoke from distant fires. Martha Caldwell, 28, clutching the sleeve of her worn, faded dress, stared up at the grizzled man standing before her. He was Richard Kincaid, a debt collector of ruthless reputation, his sun-leathered skin drawn tight over cheekbones sharp as knives. At 52, he carried the authority of a man who had destroyed livelihoods without a second thought. His voice cut through the air like a whip. "Your boy is a collateral now," he said, his eyes cold and unyielding. "The debt your husband left unpaid, your son pays for it." Martha's heart lurched. Her 6-year-old son, Tommy, clutched her skirts, eyes wide and brimming with confusion. She tried to speak, but words lodged in her throat. The street seemed to tighten around them, the silence deafening. A few townsfolk peeked from the windows, unsure whether to intervene or stay hidden. Kincaid signaled with a gloved hand, and 2 of his burly enforcers, men in their 30s with cruel eyes and scarred faces, stepped forward. One grabbed Tommy's small arm, the child yelping in shock and terror. Martha's voice finally came out as a strangled scream. "No, he's just a child. You can't take him." Kincaid's grin was all teeth. "Rules of the frontier, little lady. Pay what's owed or your boy works it off." Martha's fists clenched around the fabric of her dress, knuckles white. Her mind raced through every coin she'd saved, every favor owed, every desperate plan. But the truth was inescapable. The town's law was nothing compared to the creditor's will. Her chest ached with helplessness, a raw, gnawing pain that made the world seem unbearably cold. The first enforcer tightened his grip. Tommy's small body squirmed, and Martha could feel the weight of the frontier pressing down on her shoulders. She had lived through hard winters, broken wagon wheels, and sickness that claimed neighbors, but nothing had prepared her for this. Her own son torn from her arms under the noon sun. A crackling voice came from the corner. "Folks, somebody's got to stand for her." A wiry man, 40-ish, spit a wad of tobacco onto the street. The enforcers ignored him, and Kincaid's attention never wavered. Martha realized she could only rely on herself. Yet her body shook with both fear and rage. As the enforcers dragged Tommy down the street, she felt something stir in the back of her mind. A flicker of hope whispered in tales she'd heard of a mountain man who roamed the hills, dispensing justice in silence and shadow. Her heart clenched. Could he appear in time? Could he save her boy? She didn't know. But she refused to collapse under despair. Not yet. The dust settled like a blanket over the town once the enforcers disappeared with Tommy. Martha sank to the steps of the shuttered apothecary, the heat of the wooden boards biting her palms, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face. Around her, the town seemed to exhale, the nervous whispers of the townsfolk blending with the creaking of signs swinging in the wind. No one moved to help. No one dared. Her mind was a whirlwind of guilt and fury. She remembered the days before her husband died, when it struggled to pay the town's merciless debts, promising to leave her and Tommy safe. Now, all those promises lay in ashes along with the remnants of her old life. She pressed her fingers to her lips, tasting grit and salt, and whispered Tommy's name, though she knew he could not hear her. Her eyes scanned the hills surrounding Dry Creek, the jagged ridges and shadowed valleys where legends of the mountain man had been whispered for decades. He was said to ride with the silence of the wind, his rifle deadly, his heart guided by a strict, almost mysterious code. Martha clung to that story, imagining him cresting a ridge, dust rising around his horse like a signal of salvation. Yet fear gnawed at her. The town's narrow streets had eyes everywhere, and Kincaid's enforcers could appear at any moment. She had no weapons, no allies, only her courage, raw and untested. Still, she refused to move from the apothecary steps. Every second Tommy was out, there was a second she could do nothing. She thought of the nights she had spent huddled with him, singing softly to lull him to sleep while her husband worked the fields. She thought of his small hand, his bright eyes, and how fragile he was in this harsh, lawless world. Her sorrow transformed slowly into determination. If no one else would act, she would find a way to act herself. The wind shifted, carrying a faint scent of pine and the far-off clatter of hooves. Martha's breath caught. She stood, spine straight, chest heavy with hope and dread. Perhaps it was the mountain man. Perhaps it was merely the wind. Either way, she could not wait passively. Survival demanded action, and motherhood demanded courage beyond her fear. By late afternoon, Martha had moved to the outskirts of town, keeping to the shadows behind shuttered buildings and stacks of firewood. She observed the valley, watching the trails that led into the hills where the mountain man was said to roam. Her every nerve was taut, ears straining for the sound of hoofbeats, the snap of a twig, any sign of rescue. The townsfolk had begun to whisper among themselves again, eyes darting to her with pity, fear, or envy for her courage, or perhaps for the misfortune that had found her. A few old men muttered about the mountain man's last known appearance, a figure seen weeks ago riding the ridge with a rifle over his shoulder, disappearing into the canyon like smoke. Martha's thoughts were interrupted by the faint glimmer of sunlight on meadow far across the valley. She squinted. The figure was small at first, then began to rise, the shadow of a horse becoming clear. She could see the rifle across his back, the wide-brimmed hat, and the strong, deliberate movements that spoke of a man who knew no fear. Her pulse raced. Could it really be him? She dared not run. Instead, she sank into the brush, letting the dust and shadows cloak her presence. Her heart hammered in her chest, hope and terror battling with equal intensity. The mountain man's silhouette moved with purpose, dust rising behind the hooves in a slow, rhythmic cadence that spoke of inevitability, as if fate itself had sent him to her side. Martha whispered Tommy's name again, softly, trembling. She imagined him seeing the rider, imagining salvation in the form of this mysterious, rugged man of the hills. And for the first time since the morning, the sense of possibility ignited inside her. The frontier was cruel, unyielding, and dangerous. But perhaps there were still heroes, still chances to reclaim what had been stolen. She drew in a shaky breath, planting her resolve like a stake in the hard earth. Whatever came next, the journey, the confrontation, the fight, she would meet it with all the courage left in her. And she would not fail Tommy, not while this shadow rode toward them through the noon sun. The wind shifted once more, carrying the faint metallic glint of the mountain man's rifle, the sharp rhythm of hooves, and the scent of pine and dust. Hope was no longer a whisper. It was alive, galloping down the valley toward her. The wind carried a whisper of pine and dry earth as Martha crouched behind the firewood stacks, heart pounding like a hammer in her chest. She hardly dared to breathe, but her eyes widened as a figure emerged on a ridge beyond the valley. Dust swirled behind him, stirred by the steady, deliberate rhythm of hooves. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a quiet authority that made the hills themselves seem to acknowledge his presence. He wore a dark leather coat that fell to his knees, scuffed and worn from years on the trail. Across his back rested a polished rifle, sunlight catching the steel and glinting like a promise. His wide-brimmed hat shadowed his weathered face, but Martha could see sharp green eyes that seemed to measure every detail, every danger, every life around him. At 45, he carried the knowledge of a man who had survived countless winters, hostile men, and the unforgiving frontier. Martha's breath caught. Could this be the mountain man she had heard of in whispers, the one who brought justice where the law feared to tread? She dared not hope too soon. He paused at the crest of the hill, scanning the valley with a practiced eye. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he looked directly toward her, the faintest hint of acknowledgment in his expression. Relief and anticipation collided within her chest. For the first time since Tommy had been taken, Martha felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this man could navigate the perilous terrain, outwit the mercenaries, and deliver her child from the cruel grasp of Kincaid's enforcers. But there was no time for relief yet. The day was far from over, and dangers awaited in every shadow. The mountain man approached cautiously, leading his horse through a narrow ravine that skirted the town's outskirts. Martha stepped forward, hands raised in tentative trust. He dismounted, boots crunching on the dry earth, and regarded her with a silent appraisal. There was no warmth yet in his gaze, only the calm precision of a man accustomed to assessing threats. "I need my son back," she said, voice quivering. "They've taken him for a debt my husband couldn't pay." He nodded once, slowly, then gestured for her to follow. "Where they keep him?" His voice was gravelly but controlled, carrying the authority of a man who had faced death many times. Martha gave him the directions, pointing to her cabin on the far side of the valley, surrounded by dry brush and a thin grove of pines. The path ahead was treacherous. They moved quietly through uneven terrain, the mountain man scouting each ridge in shadow before taking another step. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine resin and distant smoke from a nearby fire. Martha stumbled once, and he caught her arm with surprising strength, steadying her. She felt the first glimmer of trust. Along the journey, danger revealed itself at every turn. A loose rock gave way beneath her foot, and she nearly fell into a shallow ravine. A hawk's shrill cry signaled a nearby predator, and the mountain man's rifle was ready before she could even comprehend the threat. Martha realized she had underestimated the perils of the wilderness. This was not the tame frontier town she had known, but a land where every step could cost a life. Despite the tension, there were moments of quiet observation. The mountain man pointed out subtle signs of tracking, hoof prints, broken branches, and faint scuff marks in the dust. Martha absorbed every detail, beginning to see the wilderness through his eyes. She noted the rhythm of the wind, the way shadows shifted across the hills, the distant murmur of water in a creek. Each small lesson was a thread of survival he wove for her, preparing her for the trials ahead. Night fell, and the valley was cloaked in cold darkness. They made camp near a gnarled pine on a cliff edge, the stars overhead bright and indifferent. Martha huddled near the fire, the warmth seeping into her chill bones. Across from her, the mountain man tended the rifle, his expression distant, yet alert to every sound in the wilderness. "Why, help me?" she asked softly, curiosity and caution mixed in her tone. He did not answer immediately, merely cleaning the rifle with slow, deliberate movements. Finally he spoke, voice low, carrying the weight of a past filled with harsh choices. "Because someone has to. No one else will." Martha's mind wandered to Tommy, imagining him in the cabin, scared and alone. Her resolve hardened. She would follow this man to the end of the valley, across treacherous hills, and into whatever danger awaited. And she would face her fear because there was no alternative. The night was long, filled with whispers of wind, distant howls, and the occasional crackle of underbrush signaling small creatures in the dark. Yet there was a growing rhythm between them, a silent partnership forming in the shared goal of rescuing a child. Martha studied him, noticing the faint scars along his hands and the tension in his jaw that spoke of battles fought alone. In return, he observed her, measuring her courage, her resolve, and the fire in her eyes. By dawn, they were moving again, tracing the valley's contours, shadows stretching long across the earth. The cabin loomed in the distance, a small, weathered structure surrounded by brush and guarded by two men in rough frontier clothing, mid-30s. The stakes had risen. There was no turning back. The mountain man signaled silently, and Martha followed, heart racing. The journey had forged a bond between them, one born of shared purpose in the perilous frontier, setting the stage for the confrontation that would decide her son's fate. Martha's pulse echoed the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the distant wind through the pines. For the first time, hope and fear existed in equal measure. The mountain man's calm, unwavering presence was a beacon, but the path ahead was fraught with danger. Each step brought them closer to Tommy, and to a reckoning that would test both her courage and the man she had come to trust. The first light of dawn spilled over the ridge, casting long, pale shadows across the valley. Martha crouched low behind a cluster of rocks, her breath shallow and rapid, heart hammering in rhythm with the pounding of the mountain man's horse hooves. 45-year-old mountain man, tall and rugged, weathered face, green piercing eyes scanning the cabin below, his dark leather coat dusted with dirt, wide brim hat angled to shade his eyes, rifle resting across his lap. He signaled with single, precise hand motion, and Martha flinched but obeyed, the bond of trust they had forged in the wilderness guiding every move. The cabin lay in a hollow, surrounded by scrub brush and two armed men, both in their mid-30s, rough, scarred, and restless. The mercenaries shifted nervously, glancing toward the valley, unaware of the silent shadow that crept closer. Martha's gaze darted to the small window of the cabin. There, a tiny figure clutched the bars of a crate. Tommy, 6 years old, wide-eyed and trembling, clutching his small blanket like a lifeline. "Stay low," the mountain man whispered, his voice gravelly but calm, carrying the authority of a man who had stared down death more times than he could count. Martha nodded, gripping her skirts, muscles taut. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the faint clatter of a loose shutter swinging in the morning wind. He took the lead, moving like a shadow over the uneven terrain, rifle ready, eyes darting from bush to bush. Martha followed, her fear tempered by determination, a quiet resolve burning in her chest. Each step was a risk. One misstep could mean discovery, a gunshot, a scream, and her child's life lost forever. The mountain man paused behind a fallen tree, scanning the mercenaries' positions. "One shot," he muttered, "to distract. Then we move." His hand rested on the rifle, the metal cold and precise against his calloused skin. Martha's stomach twisted. She had no experience with gunfire, no knowledge of tactics, only hope and desperation. And yet she would act when needed. For Tommy, the first shot rang out sharp and echoing, ricocheting off the cabin walls. The mercenaries cursed and drew their guns, looking wildly around. Dust rose in the air, wind shifting. In that heartbeat of chaos, the mountain man sprinted toward the cabin, Martha close behind, moving with speed and terror, adrenaline sharpening every sense. They reached the window where Tommy waited, his eyes filled with recognition and relief as Martha lifted him gently but firmly into her arms. "Mommy's here," she whispered, voice trembling. He clung to her, sobbing quietly, as the mountain man covered them, scanning the field for threats. One mercenary had tried to flank them, but the mountain man's rifle barked a warning. A shot, striking the ground near his feet. The man froze, terror crossing his scarred features, and stumbled backward into brush, disappearing from sight. They dashed toward the trees beyond the cabin, the mountain man leading, Tommy in Martha's arms. The wind carried a metallic scent of gunpowder, mingling with pine and dust. Martha's mind raced, not with fear alone, but with the electric thrill of survival, the realization that she could reclaim what had been stolen. Tommy's small hands pressed against her chest, heartbeat against heartbeat, a living reminder of what she fought for. By the time they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley, the immediate danger seemed to ease. They crouched behind stones, breathing hard, listening. The mercenaries were regrouping below, shouting orders, but the mountain man's calm presence steadied them. His piercing green eyes met Martha's briefly, a silent assurance that the fight was not yet over, but the first victory had been claimed. The forest beyond the outcrop was thick with pines and bramble, a labyrinth that only the mountain man seemed to navigate with confidence. Each step was measured, careful, his boots barely making a sound on the dry needles and rocks. Martha followed, Tommy tucked securely in her arms, adrenaline still pumping through her veins. She glanced at the mountain man, 45, rugged, scarred from countless battles, but his eyes, alert and green, radiated a quiet humanity beneath the hardened exterior. Hours passed as they wound through the wilderness, dodging the returning patrols of Kincaid's men. The terrain shifted from rocky cliffs to shallow streams, each crossing a new trial. Martha's determination hardened with each step. Fear was now a distant shadow, replaced by focus and the sharp clarity of purpose. She had learned, in the short span of this perilous journey, the value of courage and trust, and the mountain man had taught her that resilience could manifest in moments of sheer necessity. At last, they reached the edge of the valley where the ridges met the safety of a larger, more populated settlement. From this vantage point, they could see the smoke of chimneys and hear faint voices of other settlers. Martha held Tommy tighter, her heart swelling with relief. He had survived, and she had survived. She looked at the mountain man, and for the first time, she felt the warmth of gratitude and trust, no longer tempered by fear. "You did it," she said softly, voice choked with emotion. "You saved him." The mountain man said nothing, merely tipped his hat slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. His piercing green eyes softened ever so slightly. He had never sought recognition, never demanded reward, only acted because it was right. Martha realized that in this harsh, merciless frontier, acts of courage often went uncelebrated, yet their impact was immeasurable. Their descent into the settlement was cautious, but uneventful. The townspeople watched them pass, eyes wide, whispers trailing in their wake. Martha and Tommy stepped onto the main street, safe at last, the mountain man flanking them like a silent guardian. Kincaid and his enforcers were gone, either fled or cowed by the mountain man's reputation, but the memory of fear lingered. Martha knew the world could still be cruel, but she had learned that courage, cleverness, and unexpected allies could tip the scales. Once they reached the small and on the outskirts, Martha gently set Tommy down, hugging him tightly as tears streamed freely. "You're safe now," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. He smiled faintly through tears, the weight of terror lifting from his small shoulders. The mountain man remained by the doorway, surveying the town with cautious eyes. He had no family to return to, no home to claim, only the road ahead, the next wrong to right, the next life to protect. Martha approached him, gratitude shining in her gaze. "Thank you," she said simply. I don't know how to repay you." He shook his head slowly, expression unreadable but gentle. "No need. Just remember what you've learned here. Strength, courage, and the will to survive. That's enough." As the sun rose higher, warming the streets of the settlement, Martha realized that life would never be the same. She had faced unimaginable fear, yet she had found strength she didn't know she possessed. And in the quiet shadow of the mountain man's watchful presence, she understood the frontier's harsh truths. Cruelty existed, yes, but so did honor, courage, and the unexpected acts of heroism that could restore hope. Martha and Tommy walked into the inn, ready to rebuild, while the mountain man mounted his horse, dust rising behind him, and rode slowly back into the wilderness. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and earth, and Martha watched him disappear, the lesson of survival and courage etched into her very being. She would tell her son the story one day, of the man who rode at noon and returned her child to her, a figure who embodied the wild, untamed, and redemptive spirit of the frontier. The town exhaled, the dust settling, and life continued. But Martha, Tommy, and the mountain man had changed it forever. In the unforgiving land of the Wild West, hope, courage, and the bonds forged in peril could turn the tide. And so the tale ended, not with fanfare, but with quiet triumph, the kind that lingered in hearts long after the dust had settled.